A homeless boy breaks into a wealthy mansion searching for food, but what he uncovers is a dark secret: a woman. Chained in a hidden cellar, will he risk everything to save her or flee to protect himself? The chill of the New York night pressed against Jake's thin frame as he huddled under an old blanket, his back against a cracked brick wall. He had gotten used to the cold, the hunger, and the endless noise of the city. It wasn't always like this. Once, not too long ago, he had a home, a place where he didn't have to fight for every scrap of food or worry about the freezing wind cutting through him. His parents had died when he was 12. After the accident, he was sent to live with his aunt, a relative he barely knew. What little warmth that could have been found in family was snuffed out by her cruelty. She treated him like an outsider, reminding him daily that he was nothing more than an inconvenience. It wasn't long before the verbal abuse turned into neglect, and eventually Jake decided he'd had enough. He packed a small bag and left, choosing the uncertainty of the streets over the misery of his aunt's home. Now, 2 years later, Jake lived in the slums, tucked away from the towering skyline that gleamed above, far removed from the luxury and lights of Manhattan. His community was made up of those like him, forgotten souls from all corners of the world, each with their own story of loss. The alleyways were his refuge, but the streets were a battleground. Jake had learned to move quickly, to disappear when necessary. There were always dangers lurking, especially from Sam's gang. Sam was the king of the streets, recruiting kids for petty CME time, stealing, hustling, whatever kept his empire afloat. Jake had managed to avoid them so far, relying on his speed and wit, but that safety felt fragile, as if one wrong turn could see him fall into Sam's clutches. Tonight was colder than most, the biting air going at his empty stomach. He hadn't eaten in 2 days, and the hunger was driving him to take a risk. He had been watching the Stephen family's mansion for a week now. It was an easy target, or at least it seemed that way. The house was massive, surrounded by a high iron fence, but Jake could notice the patterns the cars left every evening. The lights dimmed shortly after, and the mansion fell silent. His gut told him something wasn't right about the place, but the goring hunger overpowered his caution. He slipped through a gap in the fence and made his way to the back of the house. The kitchen window was open just enough for him to slide through. Jake's heart pounded as he landed softly inside. The warmth of the kitchen enveloped him, and for a moment he was overwhelmed by the smells: fresh bread, roasted meat, a feast laid out on the counter. His mouth watered as he reached for a loaf of bread, but then he heard it, a cry. It was faint but unmistakable, coming from somewhere deeper in the house. Instinctively, Jake froze. He should leave, take the food, and run, but the sound of the crying drew him in. Quietly he moved through the darkened hallways, the sobs getting louder as he approached a heavy wooden door. It was slightly ajar, and Jake peered inside. The sight stopped him cold. There, in the dim light of a single bulb, was a woman, chained to the wall, her wrists and ankles bound. She cradled a baby in her arms, her face pale and hollow, tears streaking down her cheeks. The baby whimpered softly, its cries weak, almost defeated. Jake's mind raced, but his body moved on instinct. He pushed the door open, stepping into the room. The woman's eyes widened in shock and fear, but when their gazes met, she saw something in him. Perhaps desperation, perhaps hope. Jake asked in surprise, "Who are you?" "I'm Rose. Please save my daughter." Her voice was weak. "I'm going to get you out of here," Jake whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. "Why you stay here?" Jake asked in a shaky voice. The woman Rose nodded weakly. "Please hurry." Before he could even think of how to help, footsteps echoed down the hallway. Jake's heart raced. He had been discovered. There was no time to free Rose or the baby. He had to go now. "I'll come back for you," he promised, backing toward the door. "I swear." And with that, Jake turned and bolted. His feet barely touched the floor as he ran through the mansion, retracing his steps back to the kitchen. He scrambled out of the window and into the cold night, his breath visible in the frigid air as he sprinted away from the house. But the image of and the baby stayed with him. He had to save them, no matter what it took. Jake's life had just gotten a whole lot more dangerous. Jake couldn't shake the image of Rose and the baby from his mind. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her pale face, the desperation in her eyes, and the helpless child in her arms. The weight of his promise weighed heavily on him, pulling him down like an anchor. But how could he help them? He was just a kid, a homeless boy with no resources, no connections, and no plan. And worst of all, he didn't know who he could trust. The morning sun crept over the buildings as Jake wandered the streets as usual. Paper Route felt different today. Everything was different. The chill in the air, the scent of the damp city, and the distant noise of traffic. It all Seemed disconnected from him, he moved on autopilot, tossing newspapers onto doorsteps, barely noticing the world around him as he rounded the corner to drop off a paper at one of the local cafes. Something caught his eye. A newspaper stand, its front page plastered with the bold headline, "Kathy Moore exposes another corrupt empire." Beneath the words there was a picture of a woman with sharp features and intense eyes, her blonde hair tied back. Jake stopped in his tracks, staring at the image. He had heard of Kathy Moore, a journalist who had a reputation for uncovering the dirty secrets of powerful families. If anyone could help him, it would be her. He hesitated for a moment, the thought of approaching someone so important daunting, but then he remembered Rose, trapped in that basement, the baby's quiet cries echoing in his ears. He couldn't turn back now. His mind made up, Jake hurried to the at-times at building where Kathy worked. The building loomed large before him with its glass windows reflecting the morning sky. Jake felt small, insignificant. As he approached the entrance, inside he could see people rushing to and fro, the conversation spilling out into the street. He pushed the door open and stepped inside, but before he could make it far, a large hand clamped down on his shoulder. "Where do you think you're going, kid?" the security guard grumbled, eyeing Jake's ragged clothes and dirt-smudged face with disdain. "I need to talk to Kathy Moore," Jake said, his voice more determined than he felt. "The guards snorted you and every other crackpot in the city. She's busy now. Get out of here before I throw you out." Jake tried to push past him, but the guard easily shoved him back toward the door. "Come on, kid," beat it. Frustrated and defeated, Jake found himself outside again. He had no choice but to wait. He found a spot near the side of the building, close enough to watch the entrance, but far enough to avoid being noticed by the guard again. Hours passed, and the sun began to dip low on the horizon. People filtered out of the building one by one, heading home after a long day's work. Then he saw her. Kathy Moore, just like the picture, walked out of the building, her blonde hair caught the last rays of the sun as she pulled a jacket tighter around her slim frame. Jake's heart raced, and before he could think, he jumped to his feet and shouted, "Carrie Moore." She glanced in his direction but kept walking, clearly uninterested in whatever a homeless boy had to say. Desperation CLB at Jake, and he shouted again, louder this time, "I know the Stevens secret that stopped her." Kathy froze mid-step, her back still to him, before slowly turning around. Her eyes narrowed as she approached him. "What did you just say?" Jake swallowed hard. "I've been inside the Steven mansion. I saw something, someone. There's a woman there. Her name's Rose. She's being kept prisoner and there's a baby." Kathy's expression didn't change, but Jake could tell she was listening. "You expect me to believe that it's true?" Jake insisted. "I wouldn't lie about this Rose Stevens. I've heard people say she went missing last year." Kathy's face twitched just a little, but it was enough for Jake to know he had her attention. "Rose Stevens," she murmured, more to herself than to him. She took a step back, her gaze calculating. "All right, kid, I'll hear you out, but if you're lying, this won't end well for you." Jake nodded, relieved. "I'm not lying." Kathy crossed her arms, looking him over. "Meet me tomorrow. We'll talk more then." As she turned and walked away, Jake felt a surge of hope. He wasn't alone in this anymore. The streets were quieter than usual, bathed in the dim glow of streetlights that flickered weakly against the cold night air. Jake stood at the corner, his back pressed against a brick wall, eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. Despite Kathy's objections, Jake still decided to return to the Stevens mansion. The plan was simple: get and gather proof of Rose's illegal captivity and get out, but Jake knew better than to expect simplicity. In his pocket, he felt the reassuring weight of the small camera and recording device. Kathy had given him both. Were old, but they would do the job if he moved quickly and quietly. He couldn't shake the sense of dread settling in his stomach, a knot of fear twisting tighter with each step he took toward the Steven mansion. Kathy had whispered before they split up, "Be careful, Jake, don't take any unnecessary risks." He nodded, though his heart pounded against his ribs like it wanted to break free. There was no turning back now. He had made a promise, and tonight was the night he intended to keep it. The fence surrounding the Steven mansion loomed before him. Jake exhaled sharply, slipping through the same gap in the iron bars he had used before. His footsteps were soundless against the grass, and the only noise was the distant hum of the city. As he approached the kitchen window he had entered before, his mind replayed the image of Rose, chained in the basement, clutching her child. It was that image that drove him forward. Jake lifted the window and crawled inside, landing softly on the kitchen floor. The house was as silent as a tomb. The air hung thick with unease, as if the walls themselves knew the secrets they concealed. He hesitated for a moment, listening. Nothing. He moved quickly through the familiar halls, his eyes adjusting to the darkness. His destination was clear: the basement. As he descended the narrow staircase, his pulse quickened, the darkness swallowing him whole at the bottom. The dim light from the single bulb illuminated the figure of Rose, still chained, her eyes dull but alive. With a spark of hope when she saw him. "You came back," Rose whispered, her voice barely audible. Jake nodded, moving swiftly to her side. He crouched down, pulling out the camera from his jacket. "We don't have much time," he muttered. "I need to get some proof pictures, recordings. We'll use them to get you out of here." Rose's voice trembled through her tone held strength. "You need to know something," she said, eyes flickering toward the door. "I'm not just anyone. My name is Rose Stephen. I was married to Victor Stephen, the rightful heir to this family. Robert, his brother, murdered Victor and our son over a year ago. He locked me here to make sure I wouldn't interfere with his plans to take control of the Stephen fortune." Jake paused, his hand frozen on the camera. He blinked at her, processing the weight of her words. "So he's keeping you here to what hide you make? Sure you don't talk." Rose nodded, her eyes filled with a grief that made the air around them feel heavier. "If anyone finds out I'm alive, Robert's plan falls apart. That's why he'll do anything to keep me hidden, even kill us if he has to." Before Jake could respond, the sound of voices drifted down from above, growing louder. He motioned for Rose to stay quiet as they both listened. Robert said, "No loose ends." One of the voices said, "We take care of anyone who gets to close." Jake's hand tightened around the recorder in his pocket. His heart raced as he pressed record, capturing every word. But their luck ran out quickly. A sudden creak echoed through the basement, and both Jake and Rose turned toward the stairway. One of Robert's men stood there, eyes narrowing in on them, like a predator catching sight of its prey. "You little rat," he growled, lunging toward Jake. Without thinking, Jake grabbed Rose's hand, pulling her toward the back of the basement. "Run," he shouted, adrenaline kicking in. As they sprinted down the narrow hallway, the heavy footsteps of their pursuer thundering behind them. Jake's mind raced as fast as his legs. There was no clear escape route, and the walls seemed to close in with every step, but he couldn't stop. Not now, not when they were so close to freedom. The only thought pulsing through his mind as they bolted into the darkness was simple: survive, keep running, don't let go. The darkness of the small room clung to Jake like a second skin. His hands were bound behind him, the cold old metal biting into his wrists, and his breath came in short, uneven bursts. The only light came from a single bulb overhead, casting long shadows across the walls. Across from him sat Robert, his steely eyes studying Jake with a cold, calculating intensity. "Latoon, not waste time." Robert's voice was low but sharp, like a blade slicing through the still air. "What exactly were you after when you broke into my home?" Jake swallowed hard, his mind racing for a believable answer. "I was just trying to steal something," he lied, his voice steady despite the fear that churned inside him. "Valuables, that's all." Robert's lip curled into a smirk, clearly unconvinced. "You expect me to believe you risked your life sneaking into my house just for a few trinkets?" He leaned forward, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the table between them. "No, you know more than you're letting on. You found something, didn't you?" Jake's heart raced, but he forced himself to stay calm. "I don't know what you're talking about. I just needed something to sell. I didn't find anything." Robert's eyes narrowed and the air in the room seemed to thicken with tension. "You're lying," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "and I don't have the patience for liars." Before Jake could respond, the door creaked open. Mark, the old gardener, stepped into the room. His expression was calm, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes that caught Jake's attention. Robert waved him off, dismissing him as though he were an afterthought. Mark gave Jake a brief, almost imperceptible nod before exiting, and Jake's mind began to spin. He had no idea if could be trusted, but the silent gesture gave him a sliver of hope. Meanwhile, across town, Kathy sat at her cluttered desk, her fingers flying over her keyboard. She had spent hours digging through old records, piecing together fragments of a story that was beginning to feel all too familiar. The death of Annie, her sister, had never gone away for her, and now the deeper she dug, the more her suspicions were confirmed. Robert Stevens wasn't just a wealthy man with a dark secret. He was also involved in something far more sinister: her sister's disappearance and Rose's kidnapping. As the pieces of the puzzle fell into place, Kathy's hands trembled. She knew that getting involved with Robert was dangerous, but she couldn't stop. Annie's voice echoed in her mind, urging her to continue to uncover the truth. Back in the dimly lit room, Jake braced himself as Robert stood looming over him. "This is your last chance, boy. Tell me what you know, or things will get much worse for you and that woman you're so eager to protect." Before Robert could continue, the door swung open again, and Mark stepped inside with a calm authority. "I'm here to feed him," Mark said, his voice steady, "and maybe I can find a way to get him to talk." Robert frowned but waved him off. "Fine, but I expect answers soon." As Mark led Jake out of the room, The weight of what had just happened began to settle in. Once they were safely out of earshot, Mark leaned down and whispered, "We don't have much time." Jake blinked, unsure of what to say. "I'm going to help you," Mark continued, "but you need to trust me. There's more at stake here than you know." Mark led Jake through a maze of hallways until they reached a small side door that opened into the garden. The cool night air hit Jake's face, and for the first time since his capture he felt a flicker of hope. Dim light in the basement flickered, casting long shadows against the cold stone walls. The air was thick with tension, every creak of the floor above sending shivers down their spines. Jake asked Mark, "Do you know Annie?" Jake remembered yesterday when Kathy was talking about her obsession with the Stevens family. She mentioned that name. Mark leaned against the wall, his voice low but sharp. "Annie, she was Victor's lawyer," he said, glancing at Jake and Rose. "She found out what Robert had been planning all along." Jake winced, clutching his injured arm. Blood trickled through his fingers, but the pain was dulled by the fear running through his veins. "What did she find out?" he asked, his voice horror from exhaustion. Mark's jaw tightened. "Robert wasn't just after Victor's money. He planned to wipe out the entire family, making it look like a tragic accident. Annie got close. She found the proof, but before she could expose him, Robert got to her." Rose's face, pale and weary, reflected the weight of Mark's words. Her arms tightened protectively around the baby, the little one stirring slightly in her grasp. "And now we're next," she whispered, her eyes darting nervously toward the basement door. "We need to get out of here." Mark nodded grimly. "There comes Robert's men are loyal to him. They'll do whatever it takes to stop us from leaving." The faint sound of footsteps echoed from above. They were getting closer. Jake tried to steady his breathing, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew they had to move, but every muscle in his body screamed with fatigue. "We can't fight them," he muttered. "Not like this." "No," Mark agreed, eyes narrowing as listen to the footsteps, "but we can outsmart them." With that, Mark motioned toward a small, barely noticeable door hidden in the corner of the basement. It looked like it hadn't been used in years, dust and cobwebs clinging to its rusted hinges. "That leads to a tunnel under the mansion," Mark explained quietly. "We can slip out without them knowing." But he hesitated for a moment, his gaze lingering on Rose and Jake. "One of us needs to stay behind to buy time." Jake's head snapped up. "What? No, we stick together." "I'm not asking," Mark interrupted, his tone firm. "You need to get Rose and the baby out of here. I'll deal with them." The footsteps grew louder. Jake could hear the muffled voices now, Robert's men closing in on them. His mind raced. There had to be another way, but Mark's expression left no room for argument. Jake clenched his fists, his injured arm trembling under the pressure. "I can help." Mark shook his head. "You've done enough, Jake, more than anyone expected." "But this is my fight." Before Jake could protest, Mark turned toward the door, pulling it open with a soft groan of rusted metal. "Go," he whispered urgently. "Take them and go." Rose's eyes shimmered with a mixture of gratitude and sorrow as she met Mark's gaze. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Mark gave a faint nod, his face hard but his eyes softening. "For just a moment, keep them safe," he said, his voice low and heavy. Jake swallowed hard, the lump in his throat growing as he helped Rose step through the narrow doorway, careful not to wake the baby. He glanced back one last time, his eyes meeting Mark's. There were no words left to say, only the heavy silence of impending sacrifice. Then they were gone, slipping into the darkness of the tunnel, the thick stone walls swallowing the last glimmers of light from the basement. Mark waited until their footsteps faded before turning back to face the basement door. The voices of Robert's men were clearer now, sharp and menacing. He tightened his grip on the rusted pipe he had found earlier, the cold metal biting into his palms. The door burst open. Two men stepped inside, their eyes locked onto Mark, and shouted, "Get him!" But Mark didn't flinch. He was ready. As they charged, he swung the pipe with everything he had, determined to buy Jake and Rose every precious second he could. The basement erupted into chaos, the sounds of battle echoing through the dark mansion. But for Jake and Rose, there was only the silence of the tunnel, the weight of Mark's sacrifice pushing them forward, and in the distance the cold night awaited. Jake and Rose moved through the city's dark alleys. Rose held her child close, her face a mask of exhaustion, but determination burned in her eyes. Jake led the way, navigating the familiar maze of back streets, his mind racing with what lay ahead. They had escaped the mansion, but their troubles were far from over. Now they needed to find Kathy. She was the only one who could help them now. When they reached Kathy's small apartment on the edge of the city, Jake knocked quietly, glancing over his shoulder for any signs of danger. The door creaked open, and Kathy's sharp eyes peered through the gap. The The moment she saw them, she stepped aside, letting them in without a word. "You made it out," Kathy whispered her voice filled with equal parts relief and worry. "Sit down, both of you, we don't have much time." Rose, still clutching her baby, sank into a worn-out chair, her body trembling slightly. Jake leaned against the wall, arms crossed, trying to steady his own nerves. "We're in trouble," Jake said quietly. "Robert's not going to let this go." Kathy nodded grimly, pulling out a thick folder from a drawer. "I've been gathering evidence on Robert for months," she said, flipping through pages filled with photos, documents, and notes. "I have enough to expose him, but it's not going to be easy. He has friends in high places, connection in the government. Will have to be extremely careful." Rose lifted her head, her voice steady but filled with a quiet rage. "2 years ago, Robert tried to kill my husband and son," she said. "He staged a car accident, made it look like a tragic mistake. Victor didn't survive, but what Robert didn't know was that I was pregnant at the time." Kathy's eyes flickered with shock, but she remained silent, listening as Rose continued. "Victor was supposed to leave everything to our family, his estate, his business. But if I had the baby, our child would inherit it all. Robert couldn't stand that. He needed the money and power for himself." Rose's voice wavered slightly, but she pressed on. "So he locked me away, used my daughter as leverage to force me to give up my claim. He kept me chained in that house, hidden, waiting for the right moment to finish what he started." Kathy gently asked, "What about Annie, my sister? Robert also harmed her." Rose didn't know what to say. She looked confused. "I'm so sorry." Kathy understood that answer. It was like a blow to her heart, and now she must strongly demand justice for her sister. Jake's fists tightened at his sides. Hearing Rose's story only deepened his hatred for Robert. He wanted to do something, anything, to make him pay for what he'd done. "We're going to take him down," Kathy said firmly, "but it won't be easy. We need to go public with this, and for that we'll need someone credible. I've contacted Lincoln, a lawyer with a solid reputation. If we can get this in front of him, he can push it to the courts and the media. Once the story's out, Robert won't be able to hide." Rose nodded slowly. "But Robert won't just let us walk away," she said softly. "He'll come after us." Kathy sighed. "I know. That's why we have to act quickly. The longer we wait, the more time he has to prepare." Jake looked between the two women. "So what's the plan?" "We go to Lincoln first thing tomorrow," Kathy said, her eyes hard. "We show him everything, get his legal protection, and then we take this to the press. But we need to be ready for anything." Robert has eyes everywhere. Just as Kathy finished speaking, a loud knock came from the door. Everyone froze. Jake's heart raced. "We need to leave," he whispered urgently. Kathy grabbed the folder, tucking it under her jacket, and nodded. "We'll go out the back. Stay close." They slipped through the narrow hallway and out into the night, but they hadn't gone far before two men stepped out of the shadows, blocking their path. Jake recognized them immediately. "Robert's men!" Run!" Kathy shouted, shoving Jake and Rose forward. As the men closed in, they sprinted down the street, but the thugs were fast. Jake glanced over his shoulder just in time to see one of the men lunging toward him, but before he could react, the sound of sirens filled the air and police cars skidded to a stop around the corner. "Get down!" a voice shouted from one of the cars, and within seconds the officers had surrounded Robert's men, guns drawn. Jake collapsed against the wall, gasping for breath, as the police apprehended the attackers. They had barely made it out alive. Kathy grabbed his arm, pulling him to his feet. "Come on," she urged, her voice shaky but strong. "We still have a job to do." As they disappeared into the night, Jake knew their fight was far from over, but for the first time it felt like they had a real chance. The air outside the city was a quiet contrast to the chaos. Jake had grown used to Lincoln's house, tucked away in the suburbs, stood as a sanctuary, a place where Rose and her daughter could finally breathe, where Jake could forget, if only for a moment, the constant tension that had wrapped around his life. Inside, the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floorboards were the only sounds that accompanied their quiet days. The first few days after they arrived, Rose barely spoke, her eyes distant and hollow, the trauma of her captivity still gripping her tightly. Jake noticed how she would sit by the window for hours, just staring, as if she still wasn't free. But Lincoln had insisted this place was safe, at least for now. "You'll need time to heal," she had said, her voice calm but firm. "And when the moment comes, we'll make sure Robert can never hurt you again." One afternoon, Rose sat in the corner of the living room, cradling Lily in her arms. Jake was on the floor, building a makeshift tower from whatever scraps of wood he could find. Lily giggled as the tower wobbled, her small hands clapping with delight. Jake flashed her a grin, his face softening, his usual guarded expression melting into something gentler. Rose couldn't help but smile, but beneath it a familiar ache stirred. Watching Jake with Lily was like watching a memory of her son, her real son, come back to life. Her boy had been about Jake's age when he was taken from her. She thought she had buried that pain long ago, but now it was resurfacing, drawn out by this boy, who wasn't hers, but who in some strange way felt like he could be the way Jake interacted with Lily. So patient, so kind, reminded Rose of how her son used to be. With her, the grief had never faded, it had only settled like a constant weight she learned to carry. Now, watching Jake, it was like the ghost of her son had returned, filling the room with bittersweet memories. Lily squealed in delight as the tower collapsed, and Jake let out a playful groan, starting over again. Rose's eyes filled with unshed tears, though she quickly blinked them away. She didn't want Jake to see her like this, fragile, broken, but in truth, seeing him with her daughter brought everything rushing back. She had once imagined this life for her own family, a home, a future, a place of warmth and safety, but those dreams had shattered, and now all that remained was the boy before her. Jake must have felt her gaze, because he glanced up, his eyes meeting hers. There was a question in his expression, a quiet concern burr that made Rose's heart ache even more. He didn't say anything, but that was Jake's way. He didn't push, didn't pry, he just was there when she needed him, silent when she didn't. She loves you, you know, Rose said softly, breaking the silence. Her voice was steady, though inside her emotions churned every time you come near her. She lights up like she knows you're someone who will protect her. Jake shrugged, clearly uncomfortable with the praise. I just don't want her to be scared, he mumbled, focusing back on the scattered pieces of the tower. You remind me of him, she whispered so quietly that Jake almost didn't hear her. He froze, his hands stilling as he looked up at her. Who, he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. My son, Rose said, her eyes distant as she spoke. He was your age when I lost him. Jake didn't know how to respond. He shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting to the floor, but he didn't move to speak. Rose didn't expect him to. She wasn't saying it for a response. She just needed him to know in some unspoken way that he wasn't just a boy who had stumbled into her life. He was a reminder of everything she had lost, and somehow of everything she had to fight for. Now the days passed slowly but quietly. While Jake and Rose found some semblance of peace in the countryside, Lincoln and Kathy were hard at work in the city. Lincoln had made it clear when he left them here this was just a pause, a safe place to regroup while they gathered the pieces they needed to finally take Robert down. Lincoln had a plan, but it required time to gather evidence, time to secure witnesses, time to make sure that when the moment came, Robert wouldn't be able to wriggle his way out of the charges they were building against him. Jake tried not to think about the trial too much. He knew it was coming, but for now his focus was here on Rose and Lily. The silence of the countryside felt almost unreal after everything they had been through, and he wasn't sure if he liked it or not, but he knew it wouldn't last forever. One afternoon Lincoln arrived unannounced, his face stern but determined. Jake knew immediately that something had shifted. It's time, Lincoln said, his voice firm but calm. He sat across from Rose, who straightened in her seat. We have everything we need, witnesses, evidence, all of it. We're ready to take Robert to court. Rose's hand tightened around Lily's small fingers, but she didn't flinch. And we'll be safe, Lincoln nodded. We've made sure of it, but once we move forward, there's no going back. Jake, standing in the corner, felt the weight of Lincoln's words. They had been hiding long enough. Now the real fight was about to begin. He looked at Rose, who met his gaze with a quiet strength. She had been through hell, and now it was time for them to make sure Robert paid for it. Latoon, do it, Rose said softly, but there was no hesitation in her voice. The fight was on, and they were ready. The courtroom buzzed with an intensity that seemed to hang in the air. Heavy and suffocating rows of people filled the benches, their eyes fixed on the figure standing at the defendant's table. Robert Stephen, once a man of immense wealth and power, now sat rigid, his face pale and drawn. His slick confidence had long drained away, replaced by a cold sweat as he faced the weight of the accusations brought against him. The trial, a national spectacle, was being broadcast live across the country, with millions tuning in to witness the final act of Robert's downfall. In the front row, Rose sat silently, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Her face, once gaunt from months of captivity, had regained some color, but her eyes were still shadowed with the memories of all she had endured. Beside her, Jake sat stiffly, a quiet determination in his young face. He had grown over the months, not just physically, but emotionally. His resolve hardened by everything they had been through. Kathy, sitting next to Jake, her eyes filled with quiet fury, clutched a folder filled with evidence. She had spent countless sleepless nights gathering, determined to see Robert punished for his crimes. The judge's gavel slammed against the wooden block signaling the start of the final proceeding. The courtroom hushed instantly, the gravity of the moment settling over the room like a thick fog. The prosecutor rose, his voice measured but cutting as he detailed Robert's heinous actions, the abduction of Rose, the enslavement of others, and the calculated brutality that had claimed the lives of innocent people. Your Honor, the prosecutor said, his voice steady as he turned to the jury, the testimonies you've heard from the victims Rose, Mark, and young Jake are undeniable. Their words, paired with the physical evidence collected by Kathy, leave no doubt the atrocities committed by Robert Stephen are as clear as the blood on his hands. There was a pause, heavy with expectation. All eyes turned to Robert. His defense attorney whispered something hurriedly, but Robert's blank stare never shifted. He knew, as did everyone in that courtroom, that there was no escaping the truth. Now his empire had crumbled, his lies exposed under the harsh light of justice. The judge, an elderly man with sharp, intelligent eyes, adjusted his glasses as he glanced over the thick file of evidence before him. His gaze lingered on Robert, not with pity but with a solemn understanding of the responsibility that lay ahead. Mr. Stephen, the judge's voice was firm, you stand accused of some of the most horrific crimes imaginable. You have robbed people of their freedom, their dignity, and their lives. Robert swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing as he struggled to maintain any semblance of composure. For a brief moment his eyes flickered toward the side of the room where Rose sat. She met his gaze, but there was no fear left in her, only defiance. The judge leaned forward slightly, his expression grave. This court has reviewed the evidence, heard the testimonies, and reached a decision. The room seemed to freeze in time. Jake's hands gripped the edge of the bench in front of him. Rose held her breath. Kathy's jaw clenched, every muscle in her body tense. The court finds the defendant Robert Stephen guilty on all charges. You are hereby sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The gavel struck again, and the sound echoed through the courtroom, final and absolute. For a moment there was silence, then slowly a sob broke free. Rose and Kathy, unable to contain the surge of emotion, buried their face in her hands. Tears streamed down their cheeks, not just tears of relief, but tears for all the lives shattered by Robert's cruelty. Kathy reached out, wrapping an arm around Rose's shoulders, her own eyes brimming with unshed tears. It was over. Justice had been served, but the scars of the past remained. Jake looked up at the judge, then at Robert, who was being led away in handcuffs. He felt a strange mixture of triumph and sorrow. The man who had caused so much pain was finally paying for his crimes, but no punishment could bring back the lives that had been lost. As Robert disappeared from the room, the weight of it all settled in. They had won, but the victory was bittersweet. The courtroom began to empty, but Jake, Rose, and Kathy remained seated, still absorbing the gravity of the moment. Rose wiped her tears and looked over at Jake. We did it, she whispered, her voice shaky but strong. Jake nodded, his eyes serious beyond his ears. He said softly, we did. And as they walked out of the courthouse, the cold New York air greeted them once again, but this time the weight on their shoulders felt just a little lighter. Justice finally had been served. The drive back to the Stephen mansion was quiet. Kathy sat in the front with the driver, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She'd become something of an unexpected friend to the family, an ally they hadn't seen coming. Jake watched as the tall iron gates opened, revealing the sprawling grounds he had once crept into under the cover of darkness. This time it wasn't to steal food or to run from danger. This time it was different. Inside, Mark was waiting. His new role as the family's head butler seemed to fit him. The man who had once been the enemy, now transformed by the events that had unfolded. He had stood by Rose in her darkest moments, and now he stood by her again in her victory. Welcome home, Mom, he said, his voice steady but warm as he opened the door for Rose and Jake. Jake stepped inside, his eyes scanning the large foyer. Polished marble floors, the grand staircase that twisted up to the second floor. It was the same house, but it felt different now, lighter. The tension that had once suffocated the halls seemed to have lifted. It was no longer a prison. Jake, come with me, Rose said, her voice gentle but firm. She led him through the mansion, past the rooms he'd only seen briefly before they ended up in a small cozy saint where a fire crackled in the hearth. The warmth was a stark contrast to the cold that seemed to follow them from outside. I've been thinking about this for a while. Rose began, sitting down in one of the leather chairs by the fire. What you did for me, for my daughter, you changed our lives. You saved us when no one else would. Jake shifted, uncomfortably unused to the praise. I didn't do it anything special. I couldn't leave you there. Rose smiled, her eyes softening. You did far more than you realize, Jake, and I want to make sure you never feel like you have to fight alone again. Jake looked up, Confused, I want you to stay here, Rose continued, not as a guest, not as a stranger, but as part of this family. I want to adopt you. Jake, the words hung in the air for a moment, and Jake felt a lump form in his throat. No one had ever offered him a real home before, not like this. I don't know what to say, he whispered, his voice barely audible. You don't have to say anything right now, Rose said softly. Just think about it, but know that you will always have a place here. You deserve it. Jake nodded, trying to proceed. Everything. He looked around the room, at the fire, at Rose, at the house that was now his home. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of belonging, a feeling that maybe he had found the family he never knew he needed. As he stood there, the warmth of the fire wrapping around him like a blanket, he realized something. This was his new beginning. The street kid who had once run from everything was now standing still in a place he could finally call home. Wow, what an incredible journey we've just been on, from the harsh streets of New York to finding a true home. Jake's story reminds us all of the power of kindness, courage, and resilience. It's amazing how one act of bravery can change lives forever. Rose, her daughter, and Jake have shown us that even in the darkest, there's always hope for a new beginning. If you found this story as touching and inspiring as I did, make sure to hit that like button and share it with someone who could use a little hope today. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that capture the heart and leave you thinking long after the video ends. Thanks for watching, and remember, sometimes the bravest thing you can do is keep going. Until next time, take care.